Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little, and today I'm going to be giving you 5 tips to crush limpers. This is a topic that people ask me about on a very regular basis. They say, I don't know how to play against these limpers. They show up with all sorts of stuff. Well, let's take a look at some tips. First, figure out the initial limper's strategy and realize that people don't limp with the same ranges. Most limpers have straightforward ranges. This means they're usually raising their best hands and limping with the hands they don't consider to be good enough to raise. Now, tight players may only think hands like pocket 9s or better and ace-jack and better are good enough to raise, which means their limping range includes hands like ace-10, king-queen, king-jack, queen-10, pocket 8, 7, 6s, 5s, maybe hands like 9-8 suited. Some players, though, they're raising any pair, any suited connector, any suited ace, any Broadway hand. So that means their limping range includes hands like queen-9, king-8 suited, ace-6 offsuit. A different range, right? So you want to make sure that you figure out what their strategy is. That said, as a default strategy, against most straightforward limpers, you can raise with roughly the same range that you would normally raise with based on your position. If you have not already, go over to pokercoaching.com right now and sign up for a free membership. We have pre-flop charts there that will give you exactly what you need to be raising with in these scenarios. Do not get too out of line. Realize that limpers are usually limping because they have something they want to see a flop with. And if they're limping and then not folding to your raise, you're not really accomplishing a whole lot by raising with marginal stuff. Now, if the limpers are going to limp and then just fold every time you raise, that's a different story. Against those players, you can just raise very, very wide. That said, even against those players, you have to be a little bit cautious when there are a lot of players yet to act. Like, let's say the player under the gun limps, and you know this player is going to fold to a raise a lot because that's just how this player plays. You still can't get too out of line because when you raise, you're raising into all the other players at the table. And one of them is going to wake up with a decent hand some portion of the time, so you can't get too out of line. So be aware that the players yet to act matter. Also, I say here the initial limper strategy because usually the initial limper is the one that matters the most. Once the initial limper limps, if someone yet to act has a strong hand, they almost always raise. They're usually not limping behind. So when it goes limp, 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 the third limper there just doesn't have a great hand. He doesn't have aces, kings, queens, jacks, or ace-king because those players essentially always raise with the best hands because that's common sense and good poker. So the initial limper is the player you need to be most concerned with. Realize, though, all limpers are not straightforward. Some are tricky. Tricky meaning they're going to be slow playing sometimes. They're going to limp with their aces and their kings. Some players may only limp with aces and kings. So realize that. And against them, you want to be raising with a tighter range because getting limped re-raised is awful. Like say it goes limp, 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 and then the initial limper's tricky and you have a hand like queen jack suited, it would normally be fine to consider raising that because you don't really expect to get limp re-raised. But say you do raise to 7 big blinds, roughly the size of the pot. Typically you do want to raise to roughly the size of the pot, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, depending on the scenario. And then gets back around to the initial limper and they make it 30 big blinds. Now you've essentially taken a hand that flops very well and thrown all of its equity into the trash because now you have to fold to the limp re-raise. You'd much rather just limp behind, see a flop, and go from there because the hand flops well. That said, if you are going to raise the limpers who are tricky, the big blocker hands are the best ones to raise. A blocker is a card that makes it harder for your opponents to have a good hand in their range. So if you have a hand like ace-10 offsuit, the ace makes it harder for your opponents to have aces, ace-king, ace-queen, and the 10 blocks pocket 10s. It's not that relevant, but it's still kind of relevant. And if you do raise with ace-10 and get re-raised, you can easily fold because ace-10's not in great shape against the limp re-raising range at all, whereas queen-jack suited still has potential to flop a good hand, right? So you'd much rather raise with a hand like ace-10 offsuit than queen-jack suited in this scenario, assuming you have some fold equity. Now, if your opponent will always limp re-raise, then you don't want to raise with much of anything unless you're purely value raising, right? Typically, you do want to shy away from raising hands that have good implied odds. And that, like I said, is going to be the suited connectors, suited aces, pairs, because you really just don't want to get limp re-raised. I mean, I've played spots in $3,500 buy-in World Poker Tour tournaments where the under-the-gun limper is tricky and another player would limp, and I would just like limp behind with pocket jacks. I know that may sound insane, but very often that is the right play. I remember one hand vividly because it happened just the other day. Under-the-gun limped, a limper who I thought had a really good hand. Second position player limped. I limped in, I think, low jack seat, middle position. Then the button raised to something like 8 big blinds. Initial limper re-raised to 30 big blinds or 25 big blinds or something like that. Obviously, I fold now with my jacks. The other player thinks for forever and then folds. And then the initial limper shows pocket aces. I'm like, yeah, thanks, right? The guy on the button was not paying attention or just didn't know what he was doing and thought, ooh, people limp, so let's raise the limpers. And he ruined it for me, and he ruined it for himself. At least I only lost 1 big blind. He lost 8, so he got punished more than I did. But that's a spot that does come up very frequently, and if you're paying attention, you can sidestep raising with your jacks and getting limp re-raised, right? Recognize that you don't have to raise all the time. Second tip. You typically want to be raising with big pairs and big cards because those are just the best hands, right? You should be prone to raise with a stronger linear range of your best hands. Now, very often when someone raises and you re-raise, you should be re-raising with a polarized range, meaning your best hands and your hands that are not quite good enough to call. Because when they call your re-raise, you either want to have a nut hand that can happily put money in the pot or a bluffy type hand that you don't really care if your opponent folds. But against limpers, quite often you do just want to raise a straight up linear range of just your best hands. You can of course mix in some bluffs, especially with junky suited connectors or whatnot, but your best hands should pretty much always be raised, and those are going to be your big cards and your big pairs. Because you want to extract value with them, right? Also, slow playing does not have much merit unless you know the players you get to act are going to be raising over limpers frequently. Like that scenario I just mentioned. Some people cannot help themselves. They are going to raise the limpers really wide. And against them, perhaps you should slow play. Junky big preflop cards really like to get heads up or win preflop, so you should either be raising or folding them. For example, if it goes limp, limp, limp from early-ish positions, and you have a hand like ace-8 in the cutoff, you probably just want to fold it. It's not quite good enough to raise, and you don't really want to limp it because you're going to make top pair marginal kicker, which is not really where you want to be. So even with a hand that many people think is good, to be fair, whenever I was a young poker player, I thought any ace was great. I would play any ace. And fortunately, everyone else in my game thought that, so it didn't really cost me a whole lot. But as soon as I started playing against reasonable opponents, I realized very quickly how bad it was to play any ace. And those junky type hands need to win at preflop or get out of the way. If you have a hand like, let's say, king-jack offsuit, that's a hand that's playable. It's a little bit better than ace-8 because when it flops a decent hand, it's usually top pair as opposed to ace-8 flopping top pair bad kicker or like middle pair, right? So whenever it does go limp, 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 king-jack, ace-jack, ace-10, king-queen, those should pretty much always be raised because when you get it heads up, it's fine. If you're raising it a bunch of callers, well, you know, to be careful. And if you win at preflop, that's also fine. So those big offsuit hands, and again, I call them junky. They're not really junky. This is perhaps being a little bit dramatic. Basically big cards that are not ace-king and ace-queen really like to get heads up or win the pot preflop. Even then, ace-king or ace-queen doesn't care if they win the pot preflop. So you should call with hands that have implied odds, such as suited aces, suited connectors, and small pairs. These are hands that really just want to see the flop and make either the nuts or a good draw. They don't want to screw up the scenario by raising and then getting re-raised, unless they're very, very strong. Now, again, I mentioned queen-jack suited earlier. If you knew you're not going to get re-raised very often because the straightforward limpers don't have any good hands that they're going to limp re-raise with, yeah, I can't talk. You know how to get tongue-tied eventually here. I'm saying limp re-raise. Okay, let's try again. Whenever you know the straightforward players are not going to be limp re-raising very often, you can raise hands like queen-jack suited because they're just going to call very frequently and you're going to have them in bad shape. But if you think you're going to get limp re-raised ever, you don't want to be raising that queen-jack suited. It's fine to limp behind with hands like queen-jack suited and pocket eights and ace-9 suited. I recognize a lot of people think eights and ace-9 suited are probably best at the moment. They think because they have a hand that is best that they should raise. The problem is if you raise and get called or re-raise, all of a sudden you're not in great shape anymore. So do not think you have to raise with all hands that are playable. So many players get it in their minds, raise the limpers, because they read some book that was written 20 years ago on poker, where they saw a video by someone who doesn't really know how to play very well, and it's just not a great strategy. It's a great strategy if your opponents are going to fold way too often, and again, maybe they do. But I'm not teaching you to play against players who are completely oblivious. At this point in time, most players are at least somewhat reasonable, and I'm making it clear you need to adjust to whatever your opponents do wrong, right? If they just limp and then fold everything, obviously raise them relentlessly. But I don't think that's quite the world we are living in anymore. People limp because they want to limp and then call a raise. Or just limp and see a cheap flop. Do not play junky offsuit hands. As your opponent's limping ranges become more reasonable, you just cannot play junk. Even marginal connectors are not great, like 8-7 offsuit. It's just not a good hand. Hands like Ace-6 offsuit, King-8 offsuit, 10-9 offsuit from earlier middle positions are not playable. Fold them. If it goes limp, 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 and you have 10-9 offsuit in middle position, don't put a chip in the pot with it. Just fold. Sometimes you're going to get raised and have to fold or call from out of position, which is not great. Even when you do see a flop, you usually just get middle pair, bad kicker, which is not really where you want to be multi-way. These hands are just not good. They don't make anything good. Of these, Ace-6, King-8, 10-9, only 10-9 is playable on the button, not even in the cutoff. So if it goes limp, 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 and you're on the button with 10-9, sure, you can limp. But that's it. Also, don't feel like you must raise a hand like Ace-High because you think it's best. It's just going to cost you tons and tons of money. Don't do that. I want to make this really clear. Rarely raise if you suspect a trap. And now I don't mean if you think like 1 in 100 times you're getting trapped, but you will definitely find scenarios where you just think something's up. And the scenario I listed earlier where I had pocket jacks facing a tricky limper and then a call, I thought something was up. Turns out I was right. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to take that to mean anytime you have a bad feeling you should limp behind, but it turns out you have bad feelings all the time. I don't have bad feelings very often at all, but when I do, they tend to be pretty right. But I'm not saying you should limp behind all the time. So if you are going to rarely be getting trapped or you think it's happening infrequently, just play normally. But recognize that some players do trap way more often than others, and you should adjust accordingly. Remember, people limp with different ranges. And if you expect you're getting trapped, it's fine to limp behind with otherwise very strong hands. Aces and kings pretty much always need to be raised, but even hands like ace, king, and pocket queens can limp behind. I'm sure some of you are going to go nuts in the comments saying, oh, how could you limp behind with ace, king, or queens? I mean, I just gave you an example from 2 days ago where I limped behind with pocket jacks correctly, right? And I would have limped behind with queens. Kings I probably raise and just lose a bunch of money. But you're going to find scenarios where it's just not a good spot to raise. So you have to be able to adjust. Poker is all about playing fundamentally sound and then adjusting to take advantage of whatever your opponents do incorrectly. Also, you want to take rake into account. I know in a lot of small stakes cash games, they rake a lot. And if, like, let's say you see a flop, every time you see a flop, they take $7 out of the pot. Let's just pretend. And there are 2 limpers in front of you at 1-2 or even 1-3. It doesn't matter a whole lot. And you're on the button with a hand like 10-9 offsuit. I just mentioned you could limp that, right? But if you're going to limp and then the blinds limp and the pot's going to be $10 and they always take 7 because the rake is absurd at your casino, you clearly shouldn't play there because you're putting in $2 to try to win a pot of now $3. It's not a good deal. Same thing it would be a bad deal with a hand like 9-8 suited, ace-6 suited, king, queen, right? All those hands should absolutely not limp behind there because the casino takes the whole pot pretty much. So in those scenarios, you should either raise or fold. So make sure you take rake into account in all scenarios. It is vitally important, especially as some casinos are really starting to fleece their players. Please recognize if your casino takes a giant rake, an absurdly unbeatable rake, you don't have to play there. Just because a game exists does not mean you have to play. I discussed this when it pertains to playing on the sites that operate in a gray area within America. Seems like every year I get one of these sites that operate within America goes down, they take players' money, or at least they lock it up for a long time, and people email me saying, oh no, how could this possibly happen? You didn't plan ahead. And remember, just because the game exists doesn't mean you have to play there. If your casino rake's huge, you don't have to play there. 4-8 limit hold'em. It's a beautiful example of a game that almost no one wins at because casinos take too much rake. You don't have to play there. Recognize that. We're getting off topic. Let's get back to it. Here are the 5 tips to crush the limpers. Figure out the limper's initial strategy. Also, raise with big pairs and big cards. Call with implied odds hands. Do not play the junky offsuit hands. And rarely raise if you suspect you are being trapped. So that's going to be it for today. If you want to take your game to the next level, check out my very in-depth training site, Poker Coaching Premium. You can sign up for it now at pokercoaching.com/getpremium. We have over 600 interactive quizzes, 150 video classes, 40 challenge webinars, 25 plus poker courses, and 20 plus coaching webinars. Notice here, 150 plus video classes. They are very similar to what we just did here, except they are usually a little bit longer and usually more in depth about a specific topic. I actually have one more in depth on limping there. Also, every month we add exclusive new content from me and from many of the poker pros that I have selected to produce high-level content just for you. So check it out at pokercoaching.com/getpremium right now. That's gonna be it for today. If you enjoyed this, tell someone who this could help. I'm sure you know someone out there who has a difficult time dealing with limpers. Probably, of all the people who are gonna watch this, 1 in 10 of you had this conversation with someone today. So send them this video. It could help them out and help them succeed at poker and help them enjoy their hobby better, or maybe even allow them to make some money from the game they love. So help out your friends. That's what I'm doing for all of you. Good luck, have fun, be nice to someone, and I'll talk to you next time.